Hello, friends. I'm Rosie Acosta, your host and guide on this journey to self-discovery and radical love. I've walked a path filled with challenges. Growing up in East LA during the '92 LA riots, it left me searching for meaning, for mentors, for a way to truly understand the purpose of life. But you know what I found? The power of conversation. As a first-gen Mexican American, these conversations became my compass, offering insight, support, and an endless amount of inspiration. So I decided to create a space where we can share these conversations with you, our community. And that's how the Radically Loved podcast was born. Join me as we dive into topics like mindfulness, spirituality, self-love, and the keys to overall healthy living. I'm joined by my dear friend, fellow author, producer, and teacher, Tessa Tovar.
Hi, I'm Tessa, and I'm grateful to be part of this community because it teaches me so much about what it means to be human. Ever since I was a little one, I was always asking my dad the deeper questions in life. Why are we here? What happens when we are gone? What is the purpose of life? I love this show because I get to ask the questions that cut right to the meaning of life. I've learned that no matter how much we want the path to be clear or straightforward, it rarely is. And that is actually part of the beauty that creates a radically loved life.
Please do us a favor, share the episodes you love with your friends, and leave us a review. Together, we'll learn how to create a life that's truly, deeply, radically loved. Let's begin. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Radically Loved podcast. I am so excited for today's guest. Charles Duhigg is a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter, best-selling author. He wrote one of my favorite books called The Power of Habit. His latest book is called Super Communicators, and I had the pleasure of speaking with him for a special episode that we did for Radio Headspace. And we had such a great time that he agreed to be on the Radically Loved podcast. So I am so excited for you all to listen to this conversation with Charles Duhigg. Thank you so much for being here, Charles. I'm so excited.
Of course. Thanks for having me. This is fun.
It's so interesting because I've read all of your books and I reference to them a lot. And just my co-host Tessa and I just did a podcast where we were talking about how important communication is. And the first thing that came up, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, was why aren't we taught how to communicate in school?
Well, it's interesting because our parents were, right? Like our parents probably took a course, or maybe our grandparents, depending on how old you are, probably took a course called like home economics or interpersonal communication. Like in the 1970s, if you were in public school, I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, like every school in Albuquerque, New Mexico, like had an interpersonal communications course. And like, it was, it wasn't like the toughest course on the face of the planet, but what they did is they gave you a chance to practice communicating with people and practice communicating with different kinds of people. Now, I will mention there's something kind of interesting about this, which is, so two things happened. Number one is those classes fell out of curriculums as schools became more technical, right?
Okay.
It's just, as schools became much more focused on sort of college prep, it was like, well, now you need to take 4 years of math instead of 3 years of math, and 4 years of English instead of 3 years of English. And so a lot of the softer courses like home ec or interpersonal communications, they just dropped out of the curriculum. That also happens with a lot of civics classes. The other thing that happens is that for a while, given sort of the history of the United States and that there's been racial disparities throughout our history, a lot of those programs were essentially, if you were asking parents to describe what they did, they would say, well, they take kids and they teach them how to speak like professionals, which actually means they teach them how to speak like white kids. And so as a lot of the like sort of, as a lot of like La Raza and the Black Panthers, as those groups become more and more influential in the 70s and particularly the 80s, when a lot of people who had grown up among that activism finally entered government, there was this very healthy pushback to say like, look, like the goal of school is not to teach our kids to talk like white kids. Like we don't want to erase their culture. But unfortunately, what happened is that as there was this very, very good sort of change within schools, we education in many ways threw out the baby with the bathwater, because they basically got rid of what these were kind of like, basically racist curriculums. But we also lost a real focus on communication as a result.
Wow.
So it's kind of an interesting history.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I remember taking a Chicano studies class when I was first going to college, and that was the first time I had learned the word assimilation.
Yeah.
Right? So that is really, really interesting. I know that one of the biggest hurdles to overcome in this sort of process of communication has been to really just understand the different types of conversations we have, right? Which you talk about in your book. And I'd love for you to share what those 3 different types of conversations are. But yeah, just going back to what you were saying about the sort of, curriculums in schools. I mean, I'm so glad that they've changed now, but it's so interesting because in each different culture, I think it's so important to be able to keep, like the tradition and language and how important that is, right?
Well, and I think the thing that I think that there was this conflation that was wrong, that said, well, so the way that communication works is reflected by how you speak. And that, of course, isn't true, right? Like when you're talking to your parents or your grandparents, or like your abuela, and you have a way of speaking with her that is completely legitimate and builds on all of the scientific principles of communication. That doesn't mean you have to do it the same way that I talk to my grandmother, or that some random other person talks to their grandmother. It's not about the words we use, and it's not even about the language, like whether it's Spanish or English or any other language. It's about how do we form connection. And it's one of the nice things that's really happened is that there has been this division to say, look, there are really important lessons we can teach about how to communicate that have nothing to do with trying to teach kids to talk like in a white professional environment. And so that's a really healthy thing. And so it is re-entering the schools, but like everything else, it just takes time.
Yeah. I love that you said that. It is so interesting to think back, even growing up, because as a Mexican American, my grandmother is, from Mexico, my parents immigrated here, and to be that, bicultural is a really interesting thing too, because you're not really, from a different country, you're here, you're American. And so to be able to have those, I call it bicultural. It's like I grew up here, so I have a lot of those connections to 3 different English language and, American culture, and to be able to have there is a divide there with communication. I mean, obviously, like, there is that breakdown that happens.
Well, and it's interesting because I think in many ways, there's been a bunch of studies about who tends to be super communicators. And I'll mention that everyone is a super communicator at one time or another, right? When you're talking to your best friend and you know exactly what to say or what question to ask to help them figure out what's going on or why they keep dating bad guys or whatever it is, you're a super communicator at that moment. And your best friend and your mom and your grandmother, they're probably super communicators to you. But there are some people who can do this consistently. And it's not because they're like born with a certain set of skills or they're really charming or extroverts. It's actually just because they've learned the basic tools of communication and they recognize they can use them with anyone. The people who tend to learn them the easiest are people who come from, like looking around the globe, people who come from cities or nations that are ports. And the reason why, and this is actually a sort of known phenomena in academia, that like people who often like learn the most languages grew up in cities or countries that were port cities or countries, even if it's not an active port anymore. Because when you think about it, what a port is it's a place where people from all around the world come and gather. You have to be able to talk across cultural boundaries. You have to be able to figure out what people are saying, even if they don't speak your language and you don't speak their language perfectly. And so it's a set of habits that we learn, comforts that we learn about how to make that transition. So people who actually are hyphenates, right? Mexican American or Chinese American or Chinese, Mexican, people who grow up with that dual consciousness, kind of a foot in each world, they tend to be much, much better communicators because they're used to thinking about communication. The same way that if you ask people who are consistent super communicators, were you always good at communication? They'll often say things like, no, like I wasn't popular in high school, so I really had to study how kids talk to each other. Or my parents got divorced and I was like the peacemaker between them. So it's actually a huge advantage to have a background where you have to think about communication. The trick is to take it to the next step and say, there are skills that I use with my best friend or my abuela or whoever it is, and I need to recognize those as skills so that I can use them with everyone, strangers, coworkers. And maybe the form has to change a little bit, right? I'm not going to talk to my coworker like I talk to my grandmother, but the basic underlying reason why that communication works, that's the same. And once I recognize it as a skill, I can make it into a habit.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. Can you talk to us about the different, like the main motivations of communication?
Yeah. So we tend to, when we have a discussion, we tend to think of that discussion as being about one thing, like whatever we're talking about, right? Like we're talking about my book, or we're talking about where to go on vacation, or you're just catching up with a friend. But what researchers have found, and this is really just in the last decade, is they found every discussion is actually made up of different kinds of conversations. And in general, these kinds of conversations, they tend to fall into one of three buckets. There are these practical conversations where we're making plans or solving problems. But then there's the second bucket, which is emotional conversations, where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize, right? I want you to tell me, like, understand and relate and tell me that I'm okay and that you still like me. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other, how we relate to society, the social identities that are important to us. And what researchers have discovered is that all three of these kinds of conversations, they're all really important and they're all equally legitimate. But if you are not having the same kind of conversation as the person or group that you're talking to at the same moment, then you have real trouble hearing and understanding each other, right? If I come home and I start complaining about my day to my wife and I'm in an emotional headspace and she says, oh, you know what you should do? Like, you just take your boss out to lunch. That way you guys can get to know each other a little bit better and all these problems will go away. I won't be able to hear her good advice, right? I will actually get more upset because I'm in an emotional conversation and she's having a practical conversation. And until we are aligned and can start moving through those conversations together, it's very unlikely that we're going to feel close to each other or connected.
Yeah, I love that. That was one of the main intentions of writing this book, right? You talk about this communication with your wife that you were, or lack thereof,
Yeah.
And so as a husband and as a father, these types of skills, I think, are obviously really pivotal to your way of feeling seen, heard, and understood, right? I think that's
absolutely. And yet, particularly as anyone who's listening who has kids, I have two teenagers. It's not the easiest thing I've ever done in my entire life, right? And I think back to like when I was a teenager and I was like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I put my parents through that. That was really, I'm now getting paybacks. And not even, my kids are so much better than I was as a teenager. But a lot of it is like, if you learn the skills to really connect with them, then a lot of those tensions, which are just totally normal parts of growing up, they become much easier to deal with. So yeah, I think about this stuff a lot.
Well, so how does this, okay, you have two teenage boys. That's hardcore. You're in it.
Yeah, I'm in it.
So do these tools, because I find that people that are super communicators tend to find each other, right? I feel like, you tend to sort of find each other, and when you have that skills, I'm going to call it a skill set, right?
Yeah.
When you have that skill set, it does make it easier to be able to connect with people. And I want to get to sort of the science behind connection and all of that as well. But just going back to my question about you being a father to teenage boys, knowing all of this stuff intellectually, what do you do when you're trying to communicate with your teenagers and it's not working?
So there's a handful of skills of things that we can do that not just for teenagers, but for anyone we want to connect with, anyone we want to communicate with. The first and most important skill that you can get in the habit of is asking questions. And the thing to keep in mind is that not all questions are equal, right? Because when we meet someone, our tendency is to ask them about the facts of their life. Oh, what do you do for a living? I'm a doctor. Really, where do you work? Like, what hospital are you at? I'm at Methodist General, right? The problem with asking about the facts of someone's life is that it's often a dead end. It doesn't make us feel closer. So what's much better is to ask people how they feel about their life. And these feeling questions, these are known as deep questions because they invite someone to discuss their values or their beliefs or their experiences. And that can sound a little intimidating, but it's actually really simple. Like if you meet someone, you say, oh, what do you do for a living? They say, I'm a doctor. Instead of saying, where do you practice medicine? Say, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? It's so interesting. Or what do you love about being a doctor? Has it sort of lived up to everything you hoped for? Right. When I ask that question, what I'm doing is I'm inviting the other person to tell me about themselves in a meaningful way. They're going to talk about how they decided to become a doctor because they saw their dad get sick when they were a kid and they wanted to be a healer. So now I know something about your past. They might talk about how the thing they love about their job is that like families come to them during their worst moments and they get to help them through that. So I know your values are that you value family, you value comfort, you value being able to give help. If instead of asking people about the facts of their life, if we ask them how they feel about their life, they are much more likely to tell us something meaningful, and they'll often tell us what kind of a mindset they're in. Are they in a practical mindset, an emotional mindset, a social mindset? You can tell pretty easily once they start responding to your question just by paying attention to it. So that's the first skill. And let me ask you, so like, okay, so I actually have a question for you. So if you were having a really bad day and you wanted to call someone who you know would make you feel better, do you know who you would call? Like, does that person pop into your mind?
100%.
Who is it?
Yeah. Well, I would call my partner of 21 years, Tori. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you call Tori.
Mm-hmm.
And Tori, I'm sure, is a super communicator for you, and you are a super communicator back for Tori. What is Tori doing? Like in that conversation, what does Tori do that makes you feel better?
I think for the most part, he's really at this point, right after 21 years, you know exactly what buttons to push. You know how to make somebody feel better. For the most part, he would just listen, I guess, is the answer.
And does he ask questions?
He does. Yeah.
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 And like, give me an example. Like, what's a question that you would expect to hear from him?
So he would either say, like, if it's an issue, he's listening. He I think knows me well enough to know whether it's a practical conversation or it's an emotional conversation, right? So if I'm emotional, and a lot of the times I think that has come with training, I might just say, hey, I'm feeling this type of way. I need to just vent. And he'll just listen and he'll just say, well, what can I do to help? Or is there anything I can do? Or I'm really sorry that you feel that way. Right. And then a lot of the times that's all I need, right? To just feel like
it's
I'm
just to
being
feel
held.
right. You're in one way that we talk about the three conversations, the practical, emotional, social, as we call them. Do you want to be helped, hugged, or heard? Right? Which is just those three kinds of conversations, but it's really visceral because it's like when you're talking to Tori, it's like, do you want me to help you or do you want me to hug you? Or just listen, just like hear you out because this is something you need to just talk through. And my guess is a lot of the times it's that you don't want to be helped. You want to be hugged. You want him to tell you it's going to be okay and he appreciates you.
Yeah.
So one of the things I hear you saying, and this is the second skill that consistent super communicators do really well, is that he's essentially proving to you that he's listening to you. Because of how our brains, communication is Homo sapiens' superpower, right? It's the reason that humans are so successful as a species is because we can communicate. So as a result, our brains have evolved to be really, really good at communication. And one of the things that is part of that evolution is that When we are in a tough conversation, when we are in a conversation with a stranger, when we are in a conversation where we feel emotionally vulnerable, there is a suspicion that comes in the back of our brain without us even meaning it to, that the other person is not listening to us. They're merely waiting their turn to speak. So what's really important is that after I've asked you a deep question, after I've sort of learned a little bit about the mindset you're in and kind of a little bit about your values or your beliefs or your experiences, I need to prove to you that I'm paying attention. I need to prove to you that I'm listening. Sometimes that can be as easy as just asking a follow-up question, right? Saying like, oh, like you mentioned this, like what about this? Or what happened next? Sometimes, particularly in conflict conversations, when we're having a disagreement with someone, we need to take it another step. And there's a technique for this known as looping for understanding. They teach it like Harvard and Stanford, a bunch of other fancy places. And it has 3 steps. The first step is ask a question, preferably a deep question. The second step is that when the person has answered the question, repeat back in your own words what you heard them say. And what's important here is that you don't mimic them, right? Instead, you match them. You show them, like, actually, I was paying attention and I'm thinking about what you're saying. You mentioned that you're like in this fight with your mom. And like, I remember like 2 weeks ago, you were having a problem with your sister and like I'm proving to you that I'm paying attention. I'm thinking about it. And then step 3, this is the one everyone always forgets. Ask if you got it right. Did I hear you right? Did I understand? Because what's happening in that moment is one of 2 things. Either the person says, no, I don't think you understood, which is useful to know. Or secondly, they say, yeah, no, you heard what I was saying. And what actually happened in that moment is I asked you for permission to acknowledge that I was listening. And when you give me that permission, that suspicion in the back of your brain goes away. And you become more likely to listen to me in return. So the first step of being a super communicator, of talking with your kids or your teenagers or your coworkers, is learn to ask deep questions, make it into a habit, and your brain will do that really quickly. Second is try and prove that you're listening by asking follow-up questions, by looping for understanding if it's something that's really sensitive. Show them that you're paying attention and you're processing what they're saying rather than just waiting your turn to speak.
Yeah, I'm like, I want to be like, so what I heard you say is ask deep questions and listen, pay attention, repeat it in your own words, and then ask if you got that right. Did I get that right?
You got it exactly right. You're so good at this. You're like a pro. So let me ask you, does Tori do that? Do you find, like, how does Tori signal to you that he's paying attention? Because there must be times when when you're like, I mean, look, I think he's tuning out, right?
Let me tell you something. We have something in common. You've been with your partner for a very long time.
Yeah.
You have kids. Tori and I don't have children, but we've had, this is 21 years, and now we're barely at a place where it's like, okay, we know how to do this communication bit. It's tough, as I'm sure you can relate. So. When your person is paying attention, when they're not paying attention. And I think that, I know when he hears me because I can see it, or I can hear it in his voice, if he's I think for the most part, what causes the biggest issues, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this with regard to the connection pieces, I think it's one of the most hurtful things to experience when you can tell the person you love the most is not paying attention to you, especially when you need it the most, right? Or you're feeling like, and I've had those experiences. I'm curious if you've had those experiences.
Absolutely.
It's one of those things too, where, when you're in that situation, it's like, ouch, like that really hurt. I can tell that you're not paying attention to me. And then what I've found is either if I don't voice it right then, it becomes a resentment, and then it just builds and builds and builds.
Well, and it might be that when you voice it, your partner, in this case Tori, actually appreciates you voicing it, right? Because sometimes we don't realize that we're a little disconnected, or that our partner needs us as much as we think as much as they do, or we just get distracted because there's like other stuff going on. And having someone say like, "Look, I need you to focus. Like, this is something important. I want your attention here." And that actually is the third kind of principle of how to become a super communicator, like how to do this, which is, once you've learned how to ask questions and to prove that you're listening, what's really important is to show the person that you want to connect with them. And sometimes we can want to connect with someone and we don't show it to them. And a lot of the ways we do this are again, almost unconscious. So laughter is a great example. There's been all these studies of laughter. What researchers have found is that about 70% of the time when we laugh, it is not in response to anything funny, right? Like we're in a conversation and someone says something and we laugh, even though they didn't tell a joke, and then they laugh back. And what's actually happening right there is that I'm laughing to show you that I want to connect with you. And when you laugh back, you're showing me that you want to connect back. That's why laughter it happens so much in conversations. So we don't even think about it that way, right? It's just an instinct we have. But again, when you've been with your partner for over 20 years and you have a lot of water under the bridge and he's got like some big deal coming up that's kind of distracting, or you've got like something that you're working on and it's distracting to you. Oftentimes it's really helpful just to take a moment and, whether it's verbally or emotionally or whatever it is, show the other person that you want to connect with them. Because sometimes we just forget, right? But think about how nice it is when you're in a conversation with someone you just met and you laugh and then suddenly they laugh too. You just feel closer to each other, right?
Yeah.
Or when a good example is I was in this meeting a couple of months ago and we were waiting for the meeting to start and people to come in a conference room, and I was sitting next to this guy. And so I just started making conversation. I was like, "Oh, how was your weekend?" And he's like, "Oh, it was great. Like I went to my kid's graduation. It was just amazing. It was so much fun." And normally what I would have done is I would have said like, "Oh, congratulations. It's so great. Okay, let's get down to business. Here's the agenda," right? But this time, because I wanted to match the kind of conversation he was having, and he mentioned how he was feeling, what I said this time is I said, "Oh, that's amazing. Congratulations. That's amazing. How did it feel to watch your kid walk across that stage?" And for like the next 5 minutes, he told me all about what it was like to watch his kid, like how proud he was and how like it meant so much to him. And he thought about his parents because his parents hadn't gone to graduation and he was like paying it forward. And like the thing is that like I would not have known any of this about him if I hadn't leaned into the kind of conversation he's having, if I hadn't showed him that I genuinely want to connect with him. And at that point, after we'd sort of chatted about college for 5 minutes or so, the room had filled up and I was like, "Oh, we should probably start with the agenda. You mind if we move on to, if I pass these around?" And he was like, "Yeah, of course." But we felt close to each other for the rest of the day, the rest of that meeting, because we had matched each other, because I'd shown him I want to connect and he had shown back he wants to connect with me. That's often the first and most important step, is to figure out, how can I show this person I actually want to connect with them?
Yeah, I think it's so special, right? Because it just changes the entire dynamic of your experience. And I feel like this is the reason why we are able to speak and be in community, is so that we can feel that closeness. I feel like a lot of the times we just don't, and I don't want to say because we're so self-involved, I can go off on a tangent on that too, but I just find that, the last time we talked, I may have mentioned that I volunteer for a prison project. And
right. Yeah.
Yeah. So we go in and we have this curriculum, and I teach mindfulness, and it's a really great way to, it's just like be part of something that's designed to help rehabilitate people. So I find that in that space, there is no, we can't take phones in there. There's no distractions. Everybody's just fully 100% present. Right. And you're also in this kind of, intense environment. So you're pretty present as you can be inside of a prison. But what I found is like, a lot of the times with these kids, I'm going to call them these young adults that are in there, a lot of them just really have never experienced somebody actually listen to them.
Yeah.
And so when these techniques are applied, even if somebody just hears what they said reflected back to them, the amount of impact that you can visually see is just so profound.
That's really interesting.
you know?
What's your go-to question with those people, with those guys? Like, what do you
Yeah,
find is the thing that helps them come out of their shell?
I think honestly, a lot of it is just I don't know that I ask. I might ask one of the prompts that you even just mentioned. Like they might say something and I'll be like, oh, how do you feel about that? Or
Yeah.
how are you feeling? That's it.
Yeah.
Just how are you feeling? You know, and I feel like, some of these people don't even have family. Nobody comes to visit them,
Right.
just depending on background. And I mean, this is just a whole layered experience situation for a lot of the people that are in there. And I think a lot of them just have never had the experience of having somebody even just listen to them speak about how they feel. Like nobody's ever asked them that. It's crazy. I don't really talk about it. It's like my Seva work, it's like I do it. I've been doing it for years. It's, to me,
I have a brother. I have 9 siblings, and I have one that spent time kind of in and out of jail and prison. And
also,
if you just find if you find families with a lot of kids, there's someone, right?
Yeah,
There is someone who's
always.
been in the system, and yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you get it. And people, again, it's just people are so opinionated. And so the program specifically that I work with is designed for the main one. I go to a men's prison in Chowchilla. It's for uh, kids, ages 18 to 28 who are
Oof.
serving life sentences for crimes they committed under the age of 18.
Jesus.
So,
That's rough.
right. So a lot of them, most of them are in there for pretty heavy,
Yeah.
crimes. And, but what I've found is that, a lot of these kids, you have the same type of story, Charles. Like it is like, single parent family household, or there's abuse, or they were in foster care most of their lives, or, just, all backgrounds, all ethnicities. You're just in this place
Right.
with like this group of like 60 kids who are all in there, serving these sentences and but doing the work. So they have to apply to be a part of our program, and there's like a waiting list. And so
Huh.
the kids that are in our class are there because they want to be there. And I don't know if you've heard of Valley State Prison. It's like one of the most it's a level 2 prison, and it's sort of like the model for what they're trying to do for a lot of the California CDCR, prisons, California Department of Rehabilitation. They're trying to incorporate more of these rehabilitation programs so that they can rehabilitate a lot of these kids. So
Right.
when they get out, we're trying to reduce the recidivism rate. That's
Yeah.
ultimately what the goal is. So yeah, I mean, going back to what you're saying, interestingly enough, like when your book came out, I listened to it while I was driving up there, and it was
Oh,
just
wow.
it was really sort of helpful because I'm like, I'm gonna try some of the techniques, and
Yeah.
it really is some of the most profound, gratifying work that I've ever
Oh,
done.
I'm sure it
You
sounds.
know,
And the thing is that whether it's like the kids you're working with or whether it's people we haven't talked to in a while, we tend to discount how important connection actually is, right? Like there's in Super Communicators, there's this description of this study that people might be familiar with called the Harvard Study for Adult Development. So they've been following around thousands of people for almost 80 years now, trying to figure out like what helps you age more healthily and what makes you happy and successful. And the only consistent pattern that they found is that you will be happier and healthier and more successful, however you define success, at age 65 if you have at least a handful of close relationships at age 45. Because that means you've had those probably for a while and you'll probably continue to have them. Actually, it adds years to your life. The Surgeon General has said loneliness is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, right? And for kids who are in prison, where even if you're surrounded by other people, oftentimes you feel alienated from them. You feel like there's no one on the outside who cares about you. You don't feel connected to other folks. Connection is what gives our life meaning. It's what makes us, it's not only what makes us happy, it makes us feel human, right? And I'm sure when you go or I'm curious, like when you go and meet with those kids and connect with them, I'm sure that's a profound experience, right? Not because they're going to bring you like, some kind of professional connection or X or Y or Z, but just because connecting with another person, particularly when they care about the connection, when they want to connect, when they connect back.
Yeah.
It feels really profound.
Absolutely. And I think that across the board, and I feel that same sense of elation when I connect with my students, just anytime I teach or I do a speaking thing and I just meet people, or when I go up to the prison, to me, it's like, I don't need, for me personally, I don't need social media. I don't need any other, device to I'm going to do air quotes, connect with people. Like I am an IRL person. I need to be in real life. Like this is a better medium for me to feel that experience. And yeah, absolutely. It feels great. And I totally can see how we live longer by connecting with people.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And it's a very, so for anyone who's listening, I guess in addition to talking about these 3 skills you can develop, the best thing I would say you could do is, if there's a friend you haven't talked to in a year, just like send them an email and be like, hey, can we set aside 30 minutes just to catch up? Like I've been missing talking to you. Right. Or like, and what's interesting is there's all these studies that show people who you haven't talked to in a while are known as a weak tie. So like a friend of a friend is a weak tie. Someone whom you only talk to once a year is a weak tie. And what researchers have found is that weak ties are much more important than strong ties in helping us find new like career opportunities and things like that. Because if I know about a job, most of my close friends also know about that job. It's the person that I don't talk to very often who's like, hey, I was thinking of you the other day because this job came up. You might not have seen it. So reestablishing those connections with weak ties is actually very, very healthy from a like career perspective.
Oh.
But it turns out from a psychological perspective, it also is that like, you don't have to talk to someone every week or every month to be close to them. Like I have one good friend that I talk to, I don't know, every 7 or 8 months. But when we talk, like we really spend time getting like connecting with each other, and it feels like a very real relationship to me. And so the best thing that someone could do if they're listening is like, just email someone you've been thinking of and haven't talked to in a while and just be like, hey, let's just set up a half hour to talk because I want to hear what's going on with you. And I promise you, it will make your entire day better.
I love that so much. I agree. I'm going to do that today. Charles,
Okay, good.
I know I'm like, who can I know you wrote about that in The Power of Habit, right? That was,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
I loved that. What a great callback. I want to be respectful of your time. So I do want to wrap. I mean, I feel like we just got started in the conversation, but
Me too. This has been great.
I know. So for people that are listening, where can they connect with you or get more information?
Yeah. So if you want to buy a copy of Super Communicators, it's on Amazon or Barnes and Nobles or your local bookstore, which is a great place to buy it. You got it. And then if you want to find me, if they just Google my name, my website is charlesduhigg.com. Or if you Google me, I'm the only Charles Duhigg in the world because it's a weird last name. It has 2 G's. Or if you just Google actually Super Communicators or Power of Habit, I'll come up. And I actually have my email address on my website. So if anyone wants to reach out to me, I can promise you I actually read and respond to all the emails I get. So
wow.
Sometimes it takes a couple days or a week, but I definitely get there.
Amazing. Charles, thank you so much for all of your work, everything you do, and for just being a super communicator and
Thanks for
showing
having
us
me on.
the way.
I
I
really
do have
appreciate it.
one last question.
Sure.
Don't give it much thought. It's the first thing
Okay.
that comes to your mind. So the Radically Loved podcast is really all about creating a space and believing that we are radically loved and supported by universe, God, whatever higher power of your understanding. The universe works for us and not against us. So the final question to you is, how do you feel radically loved?
Oh, I mean, every time my kids thank me, or like it's clear that like it's the best. Like honestly, like I think for them, like I remember I once took my son my son really wanted an Xbox, and I was like, well, if we save up for it, and if you're really good, and like maybe 6 or 9 months from now, and then we were like getting some stuff for a house, and we walked in, and I like picked up the Xbox and I put it in the cart, and it was like shocking to him. And he just came over and gave me a hug. And I was like, you know what? This is the best. This is like, I don't know if like giving your kid an Xbox for nothing is like the right way to parent, but like, I feel I love my kids so deeply and totally. And I know that they love me so deeply and totally that they don't even have to show it. And I think that's a nice thing in life. I think that sets you up pretty well. I hope.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles. I love that.
Thank you, Rosie.
And I love that your kids love you so much. That's so...
Well, not every single day.
I mean, come on, it's
most
there.
of the time they're just like, whatever, Dad. What chores do I have to do now? But you know, ever so often they have their moments.
Thank you. Thank you all for
Awesome.
listening.
Thanks, Rosie.
And thank you again for being here. Thanks, Charles.
Hey friends, thank you so much for listening to the Radically Love podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. It really helps. Also, don't forget to check out the Mindful Love Hub on Substack. This episode was produced by Tessa Tovar, music by DJ Taz Rashid.